"Get out of my house tonight," Sebastian said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Elena Whitmore stood frozen in the doorway of the study, her hands still trembling from what she had just done. She had pulled little Lily away from a punishment that was far too harsh for a child who had only broken a teacup, and now the Duke of Ashworth was looking at her as though she had committed a crime. "You have no right to speak to me that way," Elena said, lifting her chin. "I only protected her." "You protected her from discipline that is not your business," Sebastian snapped, rising from behind his desk. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his gray eyes carried a coldness that made most of the household staff avoid his gaze. Elena had never been afraid of him, not until this moment, when the fury in his face seemed to fill the entire room. "She is a child," Elena said, not backing down, "not a soldier to be broken into obedience." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "You forget your place, Miss Whitmore. You are a governess in my household. You do not question how I choose to raise my own niece." "Then perhaps you should raise her with more kindness," Elena said before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was heavy. Sebastian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Elena feared she had gone too far. Then he spoke, each word deliberate and cold. "Pack your things. You will leave my estate tonight." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had known this position was not permanent, that a woman of her station could be dismissed at any moment for the smallest offense, but hearing the words spoken aloud still struck her like a blow. She thought of Lily, of the small girl who had grown attached to her over the past 6 months, who ran to her every morning with stories and questions. She thought of the quiet garden where she had found peace after years of hardship. All of it was slipping away in an instant. "Tonight," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight," Sebastian said again, turning his back to her as though the matter were already settled. Elena did not argue further. She had learned long ago that pride was sometimes the only thing a person could hold on to, and she refused to beg a man who clearly had no interest in hearing her reasons. She turned and walked out of the study, her spine straight despite the ache spreading through her chest. The hallway outside was quiet, lit only by the soft glow of candles set into iron sconces along the stone walls. She passed portraits of Ashworth ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she made her way toward the servants' staircase. Her heart pounded with every step, not from fear of the Duke, but from the sudden weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. She reached her small room at the top of the house and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as the tears she had refused to shed in front of Sebastian finally slipped free. She wiped them away quickly, angry at herself for the weakness. She had survived worse than this. She had survived the loss of her parents, the collapse of her family's small fortune, years of scraping together a living as a companion, and then a governess in houses that valued her only for her usefulness. She would survive this too. She began to pack, folding her few dresses into the worn leather case she had carried since she was 18. Each item reminded her of the life she was leaving behind. The blue ribbon Lily had given her for her birthday. The small book of poems she read to the girl before bed. The pressed flower from the garden where she had spent countless afternoons watching butterflies with her young charge. She placed them carefully into the case, trying not to think about how much she would miss this place, this strange and difficult household that had somehow, despite everything, begun to feel like home. A soft knock came at her door. She wiped her face quickly and opened it to find Mrs. Bennet, the housekeeper, standing with a worried expression. "I heard what happened," Mrs. Bennet said quietly, stepping inside. "Is it true he is sending you away?" Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice. Mrs. Bennet shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "He has never been an easy man, but he was not always like this. Something happened to him, years ago, that changed him. I do not think he means to be cruel. I think he simply does not know how to be anything else anymore." "That does not excuse how he treats people," Elena said. "No," Mrs. Bennet agreed, "it does not, but perhaps it explains it." Elena said nothing. She did not have the energy to think kindly of the man who had just thrown her out into the night without a second thought. She finished packing in silence while Mrs. Bennet watched, clearly wanting to say more but holding her tongue. Outside, the sky had begun to darken further than the usual evening dusk. Thick clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and gray, blotting out what little light remained. Alina glanced toward the window and felt a flicker of unease. The weather had been strange all week, the air thick with the promise of a storm that had not yet broken. "You should wait until morning," Mrs. Bennet said, following her gaze. "The roads will not be safe if that storm comes in as strong as it looks." "I have no choice," Alina said. "He wants me gone tonight." Mrs. Bennet sighed but did not argue further. She helped Alina carry her case down the narrow servants' staircase, both women moving quietly so as not to draw attention. As they reached the bottom, a small voice called out from the shadows of the hallway. "Alina!" Alina turned to see Lily standing there in her nightgown, her dark curls messy from being tucked into bed too early, her eyes wide and confused. "Where are you going?" Lily asked, her small voice trembling. Alina's heart broke all over again. She knelt down to the girl's level, forcing a smile onto her face despite the ache inside her. "I have to go away for a little while, sweetheart," she said gently. "Because of the teacup?" Lily asked. "I told Uncle Sebastian it was my fault. I told him you did not do anything wrong." "I know you did," Alina said, brushing a curl from the girl's forehead. "And you were very brave to say that. But sometimes grown-up matters are complicated, and this is something I have to do." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "Will you come back?" Alina did not know how to answer that question honestly, so she simply pulled the girl into a tight embrace, holding her for a long moment before pulling away. "You be good," she whispered, "and remember everything we talked about. Be kind, be brave, and always ask questions." Lily nodded, sniffling, and Mrs. Bennet gently guided the child back toward the stairs, promising to tuck her in properly this time. Alina watched them go, her chest tight with grief for a bond she had not expected to form and now had to leave behind unfinished. She made her way to the front entrance, where a carriage was supposed to be waiting to take her to the nearest town. But when she stepped outside, she found the courtyard empty, the wind picking up sharply, carrying with it the distinct smell of rain about to fall. The carriage had not arrived. Alina stood at the top of the stone steps, her case beside her, staring out at the darkening grounds. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and threatening. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and tried to remain calm. Perhaps the driver was simply delayed. Perhaps he would arrive any moment. But as the minutes passed and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the stone steps and the dry earth of the courtyard, Alina began to understand that no carriage would be coming tonight. The storm that had been threatening all week was finally breaking, and it was breaking with a fury that made travel impossible. She turned to go back inside, intending to ask Mrs. Bennet what she should do, when she found Sebastian standing in the doorway behind her, his expression unreadable as he watched the rain begin to pour down in earnest. "It seems the weather has other plans for you tonight, Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice quieter than before, though no less guarded. Alina said nothing, too proud to ask for shelter, too practical to refuse it if offered. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, the storm reflected in his gray eyes, before he finally stepped aside and gestured for her to come back inside. "You may stay until the roads are passable again," he said, "but nothing more." Alina hesitated only a moment before stepping past him into the warmth of the house, the door closing behind her against the roaring storm, neither of them yet aware of how much that single night would change everything between them. She stood in the entrance hall, dripping slightly from the rain that had caught her before she could return inside, and watched as Sebastian turned away without another word, retreating toward his study as though the matter were already forgotten. But Alina knew, standing there in the flickering candlelight with thunder shaking the windows, that nothing about this night would be easily forgotten. Something had shifted, however small, in the moment he chose to let her stay rather than send her out into the storm. She did not know yet what that shift would mean, only that the estate she had been ordered to leave now held her captive in a different way, bound not by his command, but by the wild and unpredictable weather outside. And perhaps, though she was not ready to admit it, by something else entirely that had begun the moment their eyes met across the darkened hall. Mrs. Bennet found her a dry room to wait in, a small sitting room near the kitchens where a fire had already been lit against the chill brought on by the storm. Alina sat by the window, watching sheets of rain slash against the glass, listening to the wind howl through the old stone walls of the estate. She could hear the distant crash of thunder, each roll shaking the very foundations of the house, and she wondered how long this storm would last, how long she would be trapped here with a man who wanted nothing more than to see her gone. She did not have to wonder long. Within the hour, one of the stable boys came rushing in from outside, soaked to the bone, reporting that the main road leading away from the estate had flooded completely. The river that ran along the eastern boundary had overflowed its banks, turning the packed dirt road into a churning stream of muddy water. No carriage could pass, not tonight, and likely not for several days if the rain continued at this pace. Alina listened to this news with a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief because she had not relished the idea of traveling through such violent weather with nowhere certain to go. Dread because it meant remaining under this roof, under the watchful and disapproving eye of the Duke, for longer than either of them wanted. Mrs. Bennet delivered the news to Sebastian personally, and Alina waited nervously in the sitting room for whatever decision he would make. She half expected him to insist she find shelter elsewhere, perhaps in the gatehouse or one of the outbuildings, anything to keep her from remaining under his own roof a moment longer than necessary. But when Mrs. Bennet returned, her expression was carefully neutral. "He says you may stay in the east wing until the road's clear," Mrs. Bennet said. "There is a guest room prepared. He asks that you keep to yourself and not disturb the household." Alina almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Keep to yourself. As though she had any intention of seeking out his company after the way he had spoken to her. "Thank you," she said instead, rising to follow the housekeeper toward the east wing. The room she was given was far grander than her small quarters in the servants' area, with tall windows overlooking the storm-ravaged gardens and a large four-poster bed draped in soft blue linens. Alina felt oddly out of place surrounded by such comfort, knowing it was only temporary, knowing that in a few days she would be sent away regardless of how kind the accommodations were tonight. She did not sleep well. The storm raged on through the early hours of the morning, and every crack of thunder seemed to echo through the empty corridors of the great house. At one point, unable to bear the confinement of her room any longer, she wrapped herself in a shawl and slipped out into the hallway, intending only to walk and clear her mind. She found herself drawn toward the library, a room she had visited often during her months as governess, usually to select books for Lily's lessons. The door was slightly ajar, a warm light spilling out into the darkened corridor. Curious despite herself, Alina pushed the door open and found Sebastian seated by the fire, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, staring into the flames with an expression so lost and distant that it startled her. She should have turned away immediately. She should have retreated to her room and left him to whatever private torment kept him awake at this hour. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders had lost their usual rigid formality, the way his hand trembled slightly around the glass, made her pause in the doorway. He noticed her before she could decide whether to leave. "Cannot sleep either," he said, not quite a question, his voice rougher than she had heard it before. "The storm is loud," Alina said carefully, unsure whether she was welcome to stay or expected to go. Sebastian gestured vaguely toward the chair across from him, an invitation she had not expected. She hesitated only a moment before crossing the room and sitting down, the fire crackling warmly between them, casting flickering shadows across his tired face. They sat in silence for a long moment, the storm still raging beyond the windows, before Sebastian finally spoke again. "You think me cruel," he said. It was not an accusation, simply an observation quietly stated. "I think you were unfair to Lily," Alina replied honestly. "She is a child. Children break things, they make mistakes. That does not mean they deserve harsh punishment." Sebastian's jaw tightened, but he did not respond with the anger she expected. Instead, he stared into his glass for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter than before. Her mother was the same way, he said, reckless. Careless with things that mattered. I watched what that recklessness cost. Alina did not understand what he meant, but she sensed the weight behind his words, the years of pain compressed into that single sentence. She wanted to ask, wanted to understand what had happened to make him so guarded, so quick to see danger in a simple broken teacup, but she held her tongue, unwilling to push him further than he was willing to go. Lily is not her mother, Alina said instead, gently. No, Sebastian agreed, but I am afraid every single day that she will become her. The admission seemed to surprise even him, and he fell silent immediately after, as though he had said more than he intended. Alina watched him carefully, seeing for the first time not the cold and imperious duke who had ordered her out of his house, but a man carrying grief so heavy it had reshaped everything about how he moved through the world. You cannot protect her from becoming herself, Alina said softly. All you can do is love her enough that whoever she becomes, she knows she is safe with you. Sebastian looked up at her then, something unreadable flickering behind his gray eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the fire crackling between them, the storm still howling outside the windows. You speak as though you understand loss, he said finally. I do, Alina said simply. I lost my parents when I was young. I lost the life I thought I would have. I have learned that grief does not disappear. It simply changes shape. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, and Alina felt suddenly exposed under his gaze, as though he could see straight through the careful composure she had built over years of hardship. She looked away first, staring into the fire instead, uncomfortable with the intensity of his attention. I apologize, he said eventually, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, for how I spoke to you earlier. It was not fair to place my own fears onto you. Alina looked back at him, surprised by the apology, surprised by the genuine regret she saw in his expression. Thank you, she said, and found that she meant it. They talked for a while longer, the conversation moving slowly from careful distance into something more open, more honest. Sebastian told her in fragments about the estate, about the responsibilities that had fallen to him far too young, about the weight of a title he had never wanted but could not refuse. Alina listened, offering her own stories in return, small pieces of her past that she rarely shared with anyone, drawn out by the strange intimacy of the storm and the late hour and the fire burning low between them. It was well past midnight when Alina finally excused herself, aware that she had stayed far longer than she intended, aware of something shifting inside her chest that she did not have a name for yet. Sebastian rose as she stood, an old-fashioned courtesy that seemed strange coming from a man who had ordered her out of his house only hours before. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said her name. Good night, Your Grace, she replied, and made her way back toward her room, her mind spinning with everything that had passed between them. She did not sleep easily that night, but it was not the storm that kept her awake this time. It was the memory of gray eyes catching the firelight, of a voice roughened by grief and honesty, of a man who was far more complicated than the cold exterior he presented to the world. She told herself it meant nothing, that come morning the distance between them would return, that he was still the Duke who had dismissed her without a second thought, and she was still the governess with nowhere to go. But as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, the storm still rumbling faintly in the distance, she could not quite convince herself that nothing had changed between them at all. She woke the next morning to find the storm had not weakened overnight. If anything, it had grown stronger, the wind tearing at the old trees lining the estate grounds, rain pounding relentlessly against every window. When she made her way downstairs, she found the household in a state of quiet alarm. A section of the eastern wall bordering the stable yard had begun to crumble under the weight of the water, and several of the ground staff were working frantically to shore it up before it collapsed entirely. Alina, unable to simply sit idle while others worked, offered her help wherever it was needed, carrying blankets to the stable hands, helping Mrs. Bennet organize supplies in case the flooding worsened, keeping Lily occupied and calm despite the chaos unfolding outside. It was in the middle of this activity that she found herself, quite by accident, standing beside Sebastian in the main hall as he directed the efforts to secure the house against the storm. He glanced at her, noting the way she moved efficiently among the staff, offering comfort where it was needed, practical assistance where it mattered. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of respect she had not seen from him before. "You do not have to help," he said. "You are a guest here now, not an employee." "I have never been one to sit idle while others struggle," Elena replied simply, continuing her work without pause. Sebastian watched her for a moment longer before returning to his own duties, but Elena caught him glancing her way more than once throughout that long and difficult day, and she found herself, despite every reasonable instinct telling her not to, glancing back. By the third day of the storm, the estate had settled into a strange and fragile rhythm. The rain had softened from a violent downpour into a steady, persistent drizzle, though the roads remained impassable, the river still swollen well beyond its banks. Elena found herself falling into a routine that felt both familiar and entirely new, spending her mornings with Lily as she always had, but her afternoons increasingly drawn into conversation with Sebastian, who seemed less inclined each day to maintain the cold distance he had first demanded. It began with small things. He would find her in the library, selecting books for Lily's lessons, and instead of retreating as he once might have, he would linger, offering his own recommendations, sharing memories of reading those same books as a boy. He would join her and Lily for afternoon tea, something he had rarely done before, watching with an expression of quiet wonder as his niece laughed freely in Elena's company, a lightness in the child that he admitted, quietly, he had not seen since before her mother died. It was on the third evening, after Lily had been put to bed and the house had grown quiet around them, that Sebastian finally spoke to Elena about the past he had only hinted at before. They sat once again in the library, the fire burning low, the rain a gentle patter against the windows now rather than the violent assault of the first night. "I never told you what happened," he said, staring into the flames rather than at her. "To Lily's mother, my sister." Elena said nothing, sensing that he needed the silence to gather the courage to continue. "Margaret was 3 years younger than me," he said finally, bright and full of life, the kind of person who filled every room she entered. But she was also reckless, always chasing excitement, never quite understanding the weight of consequence. Our father indulged her terribly. He could never bring himself to discipline her, no matter how many times her recklessness caused harm. He paused, his hand tightening around the glass he held, though he did not drink from it. "She fell in love young, with a man our father disapproved of, a man with a reputation for gambling and poor judgment. Father forbade the match, but Margaret, being Margaret, found ways around every restriction placed on her. She met him in secret for months before Father discovered the truth." Elena watched him carefully, seeing the tension building in his shoulders as he continued. "By the time Father relented and allowed the marriage, it was too late to undo the damage already done. Her husband's debts had grown far beyond what anyone realized. Within 2 years of the marriage, everything was gone. The small fortune Father had settled on her, the modest estate her husband had inherited, all of it lost to bad decisions and worse company. Margaret came to me for help, and I gave it again and again, never understanding that I was simply enabling the same pattern that had ruined her in the first place." Sebastian's voice grew quieter, rougher, as he continued. "When Lily was born, I thought perhaps motherhood would change her, would give her the stability she had always lacked. For a time, it seemed to. But her husband's debts caught up with them eventually, and rather than facing the consequences honestly, they fled in the middle of the night, taking Lily with them, running from creditors across half the country. I did not see my niece again for nearly 2 years." Elena's chest tightened at the pain evident in every word he spoke. "When I finally found them, Margaret was already gravely ill, worn down by years of poverty and stress, and a husband who had long since abandoned any pretense of responsibility. She died within months of my finding her, leaving Lily orphaned, her father having disappeared entirely, unwilling to face the burden of raising a child alone. I brought Lily home, and I swore to myself that I would raise her differently, that I would not indulge the same recklessness that had cost my sister everything, including her life. He finally looked up at Alina, his gray eyes shadowed with old grief. That is why I reacted as I did, over something as small as a teacup. It was never about the teacup. It was about watching for the same patterns that destroyed my sister, terrified that if I do not correct them early enough, Lily will follow the same path. Alina sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of everything he had shared. She understood now, in a way she had not before, the source of his coldness, the rigid control he exerted over every aspect of the household, the fear that lived beneath his stern exterior. "I understand why you fear it," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "But your grace, fear cannot be the foundation you build a child's life upon. Lily is not reckless because she is careless with a teacup. She is curious and energetic and full of life, the same way any healthy child should be. If you meet every small mistake with the same severity you would meet true danger, she will learn only to fear you, not to trust you. And a child who fears rather than trusts will hide her mistakes rather than learn from them, which is far more dangerous than the mistakes themselves." Sebastian's expression shifted, something between resistance and consideration crossing his features. "How do I know the difference?" he asked quietly, "between reasonable caution and the same failure my father made with Margaret?" Alina considered the question seriously before answering. "Your father's failure was not that he loved Margaret too much," she said. "It was that he never taught her to face consequences at all, never allowed her to learn from small mistakes so that she might avoid larger ones. There is a difference between indulgence and love. Indulgence removes all consequence. Love teaches a child to understand consequence while still knowing, without doubt, that she is cherished regardless of her mistakes." Sebastian was quiet for a long time, considering her words. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a note of vulnerability she had not heard from him before. "I do not know how to do that," he admitted. "I have spent so many years building walls to protect myself and everyone around me from repeating the past that I am not certain I remember how to simply love without fear attached to it." "Perhaps," Alina said gently, "that is something you can learn, not all at once but slowly in small moments. Lily already loves you, your grace. She talks about you constantly, tells me stories of the things you have done together, the rare moments when you let your guard down enough to simply be present with her. Those moments matter more than you realize." Something in Sebastian's expression softened at her words, a rare and genuine warmth replacing the guarded distance he usually maintained. "You see a great deal, Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. "I have had a great deal of practice observing people carefully," Alina replied. "It is a skill one develops when survival depends on understanding the moods of those who hold power over your circumstances." Sebastian's expression grew troubled at this, and Alina realized, too late, that she had revealed more of her own hardship than she intended. "Tell me," he said, his voice gentle in a way that surprised her, "about your own past. You mentioned losing your parents, but you have never told me the full story." Alina hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her history so openly, but something about the late hour and the quiet intimacy of the room made her willing, for the first time in years, to speak honestly about her past. "My father was a merchant," she said, "successful for many years, well respected in our small town. My mother came from a family with modest connections to gentry, though not enough to secure any real security for us if something went wrong. And something did go wrong when I was 16. My father invested heavily in a shipping venture that failed catastrophically, losing nearly everything we owned. He died less than a year later, from what the physician called a weakness of the heart, though I have always believed it was simply grief and shame that killed him." Sebastian listened intently, his own troubles momentarily forgot as he focused entirely on her words. "My mother tried to hold what remained of our household together," Alina continued, "but without my father's income, we had nothing to survive on beyond what small skills I could offer. I began working as a companion to an elderly woman in a neighboring town when I was 17, sending whatever wages I could spare back to my mother. She died 3 years later, from an illness that a proper physician might have caught earlier if we had been able to afford one. I am sorry, Sebastian said quietly, and Alina could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice. It was a long time ago, Alina said, though the ache in her chest as she spoke suggested the wound had not fully healed even now. Since then, I have supported myself through positions like this one, moving from household to household, never quite belonging anywhere, never quite secure enough to plan for any future beyond the next position. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read. That must be a very lonely way to live, he said finally. It is, Alina admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty, though I have grown accustomed to it. One learns not to depend too heavily on any single place, any single household, because nothing is ever guaranteed to last. And yet, Sebastian said, something shifting in his voice, you fought fiercely for Lily, despite knowing your position here was never guaranteed either. Alina met his gaze steadily. She is a child who needed someone to advocate for her. I could not simply watch her be treated unfairly, regardless of the cost to myself. Sebastian's expression in that moment held something Alina had never seen from him before, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something he seemed unwilling or unable to name. The silence between them stretched, comfortable rather than tense, filled with a growing understanding neither of them had expected when this storm first trapped them together under one roof. It was Sebastian who finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but resolute. I was wrong to dismiss you so quickly, he said, not only for how it affected Lily, but because I judged you before I understood you. That was unfair of me, and I am sorry for it. Alina felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words, an unexpected relief at hearing him acknowledge what had happened between them that first difficult night. Thank you for saying so, she said softly. They sat together for a while longer, the fire burning down to embers, the rain outside softening further into a gentle mist. Neither of them spoke of what would happen once the roads cleared, once Alina was expected to leave as originally commanded. That conversation felt too fragile to introduce into the quiet peace that had settled between them, a peace neither of them wanted to disturb just yet. When Alina finally rose to retire for the night, Sebastian walked her to the door of the library, an unnecessary courtesy that neither of them questioned. Good night, Alina, he said, using her given name for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Good night, Sebastian, she replied, matching his informality before she could stop herself, and the small smile that crossed his face in response told her he did not mind the familiarity in the least. She made her way back to her room that night with her thoughts in complete disarray, torn between the practical understanding that nothing between them could truly change, that she remained a governess of modest means, and he remained a duke bound by duty and expectation, and the growing, undeniable warmth blooming in her chest every time she thought of the man she had discovered beneath his cold exterior. She did not know what the coming days would bring, whether the connection growing between them was real or simply a product of the strange isolation the storm had created. But she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, hoping desperately that it was real, and that somehow, despite every obstacle standing between them, it might be allowed to grow into something lasting. The rain finally stopped on the fourth morning, though the river remained too swollen for safe travel, and the roads leading away from the estate were still thick with mud that would take days to dry properly. Alina woke that morning to sunlight streaming through her window for the first time since the storm began, and for a moment she simply lay still, watching the light dance across the ceiling, aware of a strange reluctance stirring in her chest at the thought that the roads would soon clear, that her time here was, in truth, borrowed and temporary. She dressed and made her way downstairs, expecting to find the household busy with the work of repairing storm damage, but instead she found an unusual quiet settled over the house. Mrs. Bennet informed her that Sebastian had ridden out early that morning to inspect the damage to the tenant farms along the eastern boundary, taking several of the estate workers with him, and was not expected back until late afternoon. Alina spent the morning with Lily as usual, but found her mind wandering more than once to thoughts of Sebastian, wondering how the conversation from the previous night had settled with him in the light of day, whether the walls he had lowered so carefully in the privacy of the library would rise again now that practical matters demanded his attention. It was during their afternoon lessons that Lily, with the particular bluntness only a child possesses, asked a question that caught Alina entirely off guard. "Do you like my uncle?" Lily asked, looking up from the book they had been reading together, her expression open and curious. Alina felt heat rush to her cheeks. "Of course," she said carefully. "He has been very generous, allowing me to stay while the road's clear." "That is not what I meant," Lily said with the shrewd insight children sometimes possess. "I mean, do you like him? The way grown-ups like each other in the stories you read me." Alina set down the book, unsure how to answer honestly without saying more than she intended. "Your uncle and I are simply friends," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. Lily considered this for a moment, then smiled a small, knowing smile that seemed far too wise for a child her age. "He smiles more when you are near," she said simply. "He did not used to smile very much before you came." Alina did not know how to respond to that, so she gently steered the conversation back toward their lessons, though Lily's words lingered in her mind for the rest of the afternoon, refusing to be dismissed entirely. Sebastian returned as the sun began to set, tired and mud spattered from his ride, but with news that the Tennant farms had weathered the storm reasonably well, with only minor damage that could be repaired within a few weeks. Alina found herself waiting near the entrance hall when he returned, though she told herself she was simply passing through on her way to check on preparations for dinner. He caught sight of her immediately, and something in his expression, a flicker of relief, of genuine pleasure at seeing her, made her chest tighten with an emotion she was not yet ready to name. "Miss Whitmore," he said, using her formal name despite the intimacy they had shared the night before, though the warmth in his voice softened the formality considerably. "I trust the Tennant farms fared well," she said, matching his careful tone despite the small smile tugging at her lips. "Well enough," he replied, crossing the hall toward her. "Nothing that cannot be repaired with time and effort." They stood together for a moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them acknowledged directly, before Sebastian cleared his throat and gestured toward the dining room. "Will you join me for dinner this evening?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty she had not heard from him before, as though he were genuinely unsure whether she would accept. "I would like that," Alina said, surprising herself with how easily the words came, how much she meant them. Dinner that evening was unlike anything Alina had experienced during her time at the estate. Sebastian had instructed the staff to prepare a simple but elegant meal, served in the smaller family dining room rather than the grand formal hall usually reserved for guests of significance. Candles lined the table, their warm light flickering across fine china and crystal glassware, and for the first time since her arrival at the estate months ago, Alina felt as though she were being treated not as an employee, but as an equal, someone worthy of genuine consideration and respect. Conversation flowed easily between them throughout the meal, moving from lighter topics, favorite books, memories of childhood, observations about Lily's rapid growth and curiosity, into deeper waters as the evening progressed. Sebastian spoke more openly than Alina had ever heard him, sharing stories of his own childhood, the pressure of being raised as heir to a title he had never particularly wanted, the isolation of a position that demanded constant formality and left little room for genuine connection. "I envy you, in a strange way," he admitted at one point, swirling the wine in his glass thoughtfully. "You have had to build your own life from nothing, again and again, but at least it has been your own choices shaping that life. Mine has been shaped entirely by obligation, by expectation, by the weight of a name I did not choose to carry." "That sounds like a very heavy burden," Alina said gently. "It is," Sebastian agreed, though I recognize the privilege that comes with it as well. I do not mean to complain about circumstances that others would consider fortunate. You are allowed to feel the weight of your circumstances, Alina said, regardless of how fortunate they might appear to others. Burden is not measured only by material lack. It can exist just as heavily within wealth and title as within poverty. Sebastian looked at her with an expression of genuine gratitude, as though her simple acknowledgement had lifted something from his shoulders that he had carried alone for far too long. You understand people in a way I have rarely encountered, he said quietly. Most who enter my household see only the title, the wealth, the position. Very few see the man beneath it, and fewer still bother to ask what burdens that man might carry. I see people as they are, Alina said simply, not as their circumstances present them. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence for a moment, both of them simply enjoying the warmth of the candlelight and the easy companionship that had grown between them over these past few days. It was Sebastian who finally broke the silence, his voice quieter, more hesitant than before. I find myself dreading the moment the road's clear enough for you to leave, he admitted, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. I did not expect to feel this way when I ordered you out of my house only days ago. Alina's heart raced at his words, at the vulnerability evident in his voice, in his expression. I feel the same, she admitted softly, unable to hide the truth any longer. Though I do not know what that feeling means, given everything that stands between us. What stands between us? Sebastian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alina hesitated, choosing her words carefully. You are a duke, she said. I am a governess with no fortune, no family connections of significance, nothing to offer beyond myself. Society would never accept such a match, and your position demands consideration of far more than simple personal feeling. Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, considering her words before he spoke again, his voice carrying a conviction she had not expected. I have spent my entire life bound by expectation, he said. Duty to my title, duty to my family name, duty to a legacy I never chose. I am beginning to wonder if perhaps, for once, I might choose something for myself, regardless of what society expects. Alina's breath caught at the implication in his words, though she forced herself to remain cautious, unwilling to allow her heart to race ahead of what was practical, what was possible. That is a dangerous thought for a man in your position, she said gently. Perhaps, Sebastian agreed, but it is the most honest thought I have had in a very long time. They sat together for a while longer, the conversation growing quieter, more intimate, the space between them shrinking almost imperceptibly as the evening wore on. Neither of them spoke further of what might lie ahead, both of them content, for the moment, simply to exist within this fragile and unexpected connection that had grown between them over the course of a single storm. When dinner finally ended, and it came time to retire for the evening, Sebastian walked Alina to the base of the staircase leading toward the east wing, an unnecessary courtesy neither of them questioned. They stood together for a moment at the bottom of the stairs, the candlelight from the hall casting soft shadows across both their faces. Thank you, Alina said quietly, for a wonderful evening. Thank you, Sebastian replied, for reminding me what it feels like to simply be a man, rather than a title. For a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with unspoken possibility. Alina felt her heart pounding in her chest, aware of how close they stood, aware of the warmth radiating from him, aware of the way his gray eyes seemed to search hers for something neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. It was Sebastian who finally stepped back first, though the reluctance in his movement was unmistakable. Good night, Alina, he said softly. Good night, Sebastian, she replied, and made her way up the stairs, her heart still racing long after she reached the privacy of her room, her mind consumed entirely by thoughts of gray eyes and candlelight, and the dangerous, wonderful possibility of a future she had never allowed herself to imagine before tonight. The fifth day brought clear skies, the sun finally breaking fully through the clouds that had hung over the estate for nearly a week. The ground still bore the marks of the storm, fallen branches scattered across the lawns, puddles collecting in the low points of the garden paths. But the worst of the damage had already been addressed by the estate staff, and a sense of returning normalcy began to settle over the household. For Alina, this returning normalcy brought with it a quiet anxiety she could not fully shake. The roads, though still muddy, were said to be passable within another day or two, which meant her time at the estate, and with Sebastian, was rapidly drawing to a close. She found herself treasuring every small moment with a new intensity, aware that each conversation, each shared smile, might be among the last she would ever share with this man who had so unexpectedly captured her heart. Lily seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere as well, though her 9-year-old understanding of the situation manifested in far more direct action than either adult expected. That afternoon, during what was meant to be a simple walk through the gardens to assess the storm damage, Lily insisted on bringing both Alina and Sebastian along together, chattering happily about the flowers that had survived the rain and the ones that would need replanting. "Uncle Sebastian, look," Lily called out at one point, pointing toward a cluster of roses that had somehow weathered the storm intact, their pink blooms glistening with leftover raindrops. "Alina said these were her favorite. Do you not think they are beautiful?" Sebastian glanced toward Alina, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Very beautiful," he agreed, though his gaze lingered on Alina rather than the flowers, a fact that did not escape Lily's notice. "You should give her some," Lily suggested with the shameless directness only a child could manage. "Grown-ups like flowers when someone likes them." Alina felt heat rush to her cheeks, and she caught Sebastian fighting back a laugh at his niece's forthright matchmaking attempts. "Lily, that is quite enough," Alina said gently, though there was no real reprimand in her tone. "But it is true," Lily insisted, undeterred. "You like Uncle Sebastian and he likes you. Everyone can see it except you two seem to be pretending not to notice." Sebastian cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard by his niece's blunt observation, but rather than deny it outright, he simply knelt down to Lily's level, his expression gentle. "Some things," he said carefully, "are complicated for grown-ups in ways that are difficult to explain to children. But you are a very perceptive young lady, and I am proud of you for speaking your mind." "That did not answer my question," Lily pointed out with a stubbornness that reminded Alina strongly of her uncle. Sebastian laughed then, a genuine, warm sound that Alina had rarely heard from him, and the sound of it sent a wave of affection through her chest so strong it nearly took her breath away. "Go and pick some flowers for the dinner table," he said to Lily, gently steering the conversation elsewhere. "I believe Mrs. Bennet would appreciate fresh blooms after such a dreary week." Lily, easily distracted by the suggestion, skipped off toward a patch of surviving wildflowers, leaving Sebastian and Alina alone together on the garden path, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, the air still fresh with the scent of recent rain. "She is not entirely wrong," Sebastian said quietly, once his niece was safely out of earshot, his gray eyes meeting Alina's with an intensity that made her heart race. "About which part?" Alina asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About all of it," Sebastian said, stepping closer to her, close enough that Alina could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that she found it difficult to think clearly. "I have spent 5 days trying to convince myself that what I feel for you is simply gratitude, or perhaps loneliness finding comfort in unexpected company. But I no longer believe that is the truth." Alina's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Sebastian," she began, though she was not entirely certain what she intended to say next, her mind and heart caught in a tangle of hope and practical fear. "I know what stands between us," Sebastian continued before she could finish, his voice low and earnest. "I know the difficulties, the expectations, the judgment we would both face. But Alina, these past days with you have shown me a version of happiness I did not know I was still capable of feeling. I find myself unwilling to simply let that go without at least acknowledging what it means." He reached out then, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing softly against her skin, and Alina leaned into the touch despite every rational voice in her mind warning her of the impossibility of what was happening between them. She looked up at him, at the vulnerability and hope written so plainly across his features, and felt herself leaning closer, drawn toward him by a pull she no longer had the strength or the desire to resist. Their faces were inches apart, close enough that Alina could feel his breath warm against her lips, close enough that the entire world seemed to narrow down to this single moment, this single point of connection between them, when the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path shattered the fragile intimacy of the moment entirely. "Your Grace," one of the household staff called out, breathless from running. An urgent message just arrived from the county magistrate. Sebastian stepped back immediately, the moment broken, though Alina could see the frustration flickering across his features, before he composed himself into the more familiar, formal mask he wore in front of his staff. "What is it?" he asked, his voice returning to its usual authoritative tone. The messenger explained quickly that a matter of some urgency had arisen involving a dispute between two tenant families over boundary lines that had shifted during the flooding. A dispute that threatened to turn violent if not addressed immediately by someone with the authority to settle it. Sebastian glanced back at Alina, an apology evident in his expression even as duty called him away. "I must attend to this," he said quietly. "I am sorry for the interruption." "Of course," Alina said, though her voice trembled slightly with the lingering emotion of what had almost happened between them. "Duty must come first." Sebastian hesitated a moment longer, as though he wanted to say something more, but the urgency of the situation did not allow for further delay. He nodded once, a silent promise that this conversation was not truly finished, before following the messenger back toward the house, leaving Alina alone in the garden with her thoughts and her rapidly beating heart. She remained there for a long while after he departed, staring at the roses Lily had pointed out earlier, her mind replaying the moment that had passed between them, the words he had spoken, the tenderness of his touch against her cheek. She did not know what would happen now, whether the interruption had simply delayed the inevitable or whether it had granted them both the space needed to reconsider the wisdom of what nearly occurred between them. Lily returned a short while later, her arms full of wildflowers, entirely unaware of what had transpired in her brief absence. "Where did Uncle Sebastian go?" she asked, looking around the empty garden. "He had important business to attend to," Alina explained gently, helping the girl arrange her collected flowers into a more manageable bundle. "Did he give you flowers?" Lily asked hopefully. Alina smiled despite herself, despite the lingering uncertainty churning in her chest. "Not today," she said, "perhaps another time." They made their way back toward the house together, Lily chattering happily about her flower collection, while Alina's mind remained entirely occupied with thoughts of what had almost happened, and what it might mean for the uncertain future stretching ahead of her. Sebastian did not return until dinner time, his expression tired and troubled from the difficult negotiations required to settle the tenant dispute without resorting to more severe measures. Alina watched him carefully throughout the meal, noting the exhaustion evident in his features, the way the earlier warmth between them seemed muted beneath the weight of his day's responsibilities. It was not until after dinner, when Lily had been sent to bed, and the house had grown quiet once more, that Sebastian finally sought Alina out, finding her once again in the library where their most honest conversations seemed to naturally occur. "I apologize for the interruption this afternoon," he said, settling into the chair across from her, though his posture remained tense, uncertain in a way that concerned Alina. "There is no need to apologize," she said gently. "Your responsibilities to your tenants are important. I understand that." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire rather than at her, before he finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weight she had not expected. "The tenant dispute reminded me of something I had perhaps allowed myself to forget these past few days," he said carefully. "The full weight of what my position demands, the responsibilities I carry not only for myself, but for everyone who depends upon this estate. It is not a simple matter, Alina, choosing to pursue happiness when so many others depend on the decisions I make. Alina felt her heart sink slightly at his words, sensing the direction the conversation was heading, though she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. I do not say this to withdraw what I said to you earlier, he continued, finally meeting her eyes. I meant every word, but I would be dishonest if I did not acknowledge the very real obstacles standing between what I want and what duty demands of me. I understand, Alina said quietly, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, a familiar ache settling back into her chest, the same ache she had felt the night he first ordered her to leave. They sat together in troubled silence for a while longer, the earlier warmth between them tempered now by the weight of reality pressing in around them both, neither of them certain how to bridge the gap between what their hearts wanted and what the world around them seemed determined to demand instead. The sixth day brought an unexpected visitor to the estate, one whose arrival threatened to unravel the fragile connection that had grown between Alina and Sebastian over the course of the storm. Lady Augusta Pembroke, Sebastian's aunt on his father's side, arrived unannounced shortly after breakfast, having heard reports of the flooding and wishing to confirm her nephew's welfare in person, though Alina suspected, from the moment the older woman's sharp eyes settled upon her, that concern for Sebastian's welfare was not the only motive behind the visit. Lady Pembroke was a formidable woman, tall and elegant despite her advancing years, with a manner of speaking that made even simple pleasantries feel like carefully calculated assessments. She greeted Sebastian warmly enough, embracing him with genuine affection, but her gaze shifted quickly and pointedly toward Alina, who stood a respectful distance away, uncertain of her place in this sudden formal gathering. "And who might this be?" Lady Pembroke asked, her tone polite but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "This is Miss Alina Whitmore," Sebastian said, his voice carefully neutral. "She is Lily's governess. The storm delayed her travels." Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose slightly at this explanation, her gaze moving between Sebastian and Alina with an assessment that made Alina distinctly uncomfortable, as though the older woman could see far more than either of them intended to reveal. "I see," Lady Pembroke said simply, though her tone suggested she understood considerably more than the brief introduction had explained. Alina excused herself soon after, retreating to attend to Lily's lessons, while Sebastian settled his aunt into the drawing room for what promised to be a lengthy visit. But even from the schoolroom, Alina could hear fragments of conversation drifting through the halls, Lady Pembroke's voice carrying with a particular clarity that suggested she did not entirely mind being overheard. It was during the midday meal, when the entire household gathered together, that Lady Pembroke's true purpose for the visit became apparent. She spoke at length about a young woman named Miss Catherine Ellsworth, the daughter of a prominent family with substantial holdings in the neighboring county, praising her accomplishments, her breeding, her suitability as a match for a man in Sebastian's position. "She has expressed considerable interest in renewing your acquaintance," Lady Pembroke said pointedly, addressing Sebastian directly while her gaze occasionally flicked toward Alina, seated further down the table in her role as governess rather than guest. "It has been far too long since you have properly considered your obligations to the family name, Sebastian. Lily needs a proper mother, someone who can guide her into society appropriately. And you, my dear nephew, need a wife who understands the responsibilities that come with your position." Alina felt each word land like a small blow, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, focusing on her meal rather than allowing her distress to show. She had known, of course, that any connection between herself and Sebastian faced insurmountable obstacles, but hearing those obstacles spoken aloud so directly, so dismissively of her own presence in the room, made the reality of their impossible situation impossible to ignore any longer. Sebastian, to his credit, did not immediately agree with his aunt's suggestions, deflecting the conversation with practiced diplomacy. But Alina noticed he did not outright refuse the idea either, and that hesitation, however understandable given the pressures of his position, settled like a stone in her chest. After the meal concluded, Lady Pembroke requested a private moment with Alina, a request that filled Alina with a sense of dread she could not quite shake. She followed the older woman into a small sitting room, where Lady Pembroke settled herself with the composed authority of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. "Miss Whitmore," Lady Pembroke began, her tone considerably less polite now that Sebastian was no longer present to witness the exchange. "I believe you understand precisely why I wish to speak with you privately." "I am not certain I do, my lady," Alina said carefully, though she suspected quite strongly what was coming. Lady Pembroke's expression grew sharper. "My nephew has faced considerable hardship in his life," she said. "The loss of his sister, the burden of raising Lily alone, the weight of responsibilities he never asked for but has carried with remarkable dedication nonetheless. I will not stand by and watch him make a decision that could damage the reputation and stability he has worked so hard to maintain." "I have no intention of causing him any harm," Alina said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Perhaps not intentionally," Lady Pembroke replied. "But intention matters little when consequence follows regardless. A match between a duke and a governess, however genuine the feelings involved, would create a scandal that would follow Sebastian and Lily for the rest of their lives. Society does not forgive such transgressions easily. Miss Whitmore and Lily's future prospects, her ability to make a respectable match of her own someday, would be severely damaged by association with such controversy." Alina felt the truth in Lady Pembroke's words settle heavily upon her, confirming fears she had carried quietly since the very first moment she recognized the growing connection between herself and Sebastian. "I understand your concerns," Alina said quietly. "Then you understand what must be done," Lady Pembroke said, her tone softening slightly, though not with any real warmth. "I do not say this to be cruel, Miss Whitmore. I can see that you care for my nephew, and I do not doubt his feelings for you are genuine as well. But genuine feeling is not always sufficient to overcome the practical realities of the world we live in. The kindest thing you could do for him, and for Lily, would be to remove yourself from the situation before it grows any more complicated than it already has." Alina left that conversation with her heart heavier than it had been since the night Sebastian first ordered her to leave, the weight of Lady Pembroke's words settling into every corner of her mind. She knew, rationally, that the older woman spoke the truth, that whatever connection had grown between herself and Sebastian over these past days faced obstacles far greater than either of them could easily overcome. But knowing the truth of the situation did nothing to ease the ache spreading through her chest at the thought of walking away from something that had felt, for the first time in years, like genuine happiness within reach. She spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, avoiding both Sebastian and Lady Pembroke as much as possible while she wrestled with the decision forming in her mind. By evening, she had reached a painful but resolute conclusion. The roads, according to the latest reports from the stable staff, would be passable by morning. She would leave then, before her presence caused any further complication for Sebastian or damaged Lily's future prospects. It was, she told herself firmly, the only reasonable choice available to her, regardless of how deeply it would wound her own heart to make it. Sebastian sought her out that evening, finding her once again near the library, though this time Alina remained standing near the doorway rather than settling into their usual chairs by the fire, a small physical distance that reflected the emotional distance she was trying, desperately, to re-establish between them. "My aunt spoke with you," Sebastian said, not quite a question, his expression troubled as he studied her guarded posture. "She did," Alina confirmed, keeping her voice carefully steady. "I am sorry if she was unkind," Sebastian said. "She means well, though her methods can be rather direct." "She spoke the truth," Alina said simply. "Whether or not her methods were kind does not change the accuracy of what she said." Sebastian's expression grew troubled, and he stepped closer, though Alina found herself instinctively stepping back, maintaining the distance she needed to protect her own heart from further hope that might only lead to greater heartbreak. "Alina," he began, but she shook her head, cutting him off before he could continue. "The roads will be passable tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I will be leaving in the morning." Sebastian's face fell, a mixture of hurt and confusion crossing his features. "Because of what my aunt said?" he asked. "Because it is the sensible choice," Alina said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them. "Your position, Lily's future, the reputation you have worked so hard to maintain, none of these things should be risked for feelings that, however genuine, cannot realistically overcome the obstacles standing between us." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with an emotion Alina could not quite identify, before he finally spoke again, his voice low and intense. "I am tired," he said, "of allowing duty and expectation to dictate every decision in my life. I have done so for as long as I can remember, and it has cost me more happiness than I care to admit. I do not wish to make that same mistake again, not when it comes to something as important as this." Alina felt her resolve wavering at his words, at the earnest conviction in his gray eyes, but she forced herself to remain firm, remembering Lady Pembroke's warning about the damage such a match would cause, not only to Sebastian but to Lily's future as well. "Please," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to remain composed, "do not make this more difficult than it already is." Sebastian studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his own desires and the practical concerns she had raised, before he finally nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "If that is truly what you wish," he said quietly, "I will not stand in your way." "It is what must happen," Alina said, though her heart felt as though it were breaking with every word. She retired to her room shortly after, leaving Sebastian standing alone in the library, and spent the remainder of the evening finishing her packing, her movements slow and heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. She told herself again and again that this was the right choice, the sensible choice, the only choice that truly protected everyone involved. But as she closed her case for the second time in less than a week, she could not quite convince her aching heart that sensibility and rightness were always the same thing. Sebastian did not sleep that night. He remained in the library long after Alina retired, staring into the dying embers of the fire, his mind consumed entirely by the conversation that had passed between them. Every instinct he possessed told him that letting her leave was a mistake, yet the years of ingrained duty, the weight of responsibility his aunt had so pointedly reminded him of, kept him rooted in place, unable to act on the desperate desire building within his chest to run after her and demand she reconsider. He thought of Margaret, of the reckless choices that had cost his sister everything, and wondered, for the first time, whether his fear of repeating those mistakes had calcified into something far more damaging, a rigid adherence to duty so complete that it left no room for genuine happiness, for the kind of love that might actually sustain a person through hardship rather than lead them into it. He thought of Alina, of the quiet strength she carried despite years of hardship, of the fierce protectiveness she had shown toward Lily from the very first moment they met, of the honesty and warmth that had gradually thawed the cold defenses he had spent years building around his heart. She was nothing like Margaret's reckless husband, nothing like the careless choices that had destroyed his sister's life. She was steady, thoughtful, and genuine in every way that mattered, and the realization that he was about to let her walk away simply because society deemed the match inappropriate filled him with a sudden, overwhelming sense of shame. Lady Pembroke found him still sitting in the library as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky outside the windows, his expression haggard from a sleepless night of internal struggle. "You look as though you have not slept at all," she observed, settling into the chair across from him with the same composed authority she brought to every interaction. "I have not," Sebastian admitted, too exhausted to maintain any pretense with his aunt. Lady Pembroke studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer than it had been the previous evening. "I spoke harshly to Miss Whitmore yesterday," she said. "I do not regret raising practical concerns, Sebastian, but I have been considering the matter further through the night, and I find myself wondering whether I was too quick to dismiss the genuine feeling I observed between the two of you." Sebastian looked up at his aunt, surprised by this unexpected shift in her position. I have watched you for many years, Sebastian, Lady Pembroke continued. Since your sister's death, since Lily came into your care, I have watched you carry burden after burden with barely a moment's respite, barely a moment of genuine happiness allowed into your life. I raised concerns about Miss Whitmore because I feared scandal, because I feared for Lily's future prospects, and those concerns remain valid. But I also watched you at dinner yesterday, and I have not seen you smile so genuinely in years, not since before Margaret's troubles began. Sebastian said nothing, waiting for his aunt to continue, uncertain where this unexpected change of heart might be leading. Reputation and scandal are serious matters, Lady Pembroke said, but they are not immovable. Society's opinions shift with time, particularly when a man of your position and influence chooses to stand firmly behind his decisions rather than apologizing for them. If you truly believe this woman is worthy of your affection, worthy of raising Lily alongside you, then perhaps the greater mistake would be allowing fear of judgment to cost you a genuine chance at happiness. Sebastian stared at his aunt, hardly able to believe the words coming from a woman who had so firmly opposed the match only hours before. What changed your mind? He asked quietly. Lady Pembroke's expression softened further, a rare vulnerability crossing her usually composed features. I lost my own chance at genuine happiness many years ago, she admitted. I chose duty over love when I was young, believing it was the responsible choice, the choice my family expected of me. I have lived comfortably enough in the years since, but I have never stopped wondering what my life might have been had I chosen differently. I do not wish to see you make the same mistake I made, Sebastian, particularly not when I can see so clearly how much this woman means to you. Sebastian felt something shift within his chest at his aunt's unexpected confession, a renewed sense of clarity settling over the confusion and doubt that had plagued him throughout the sleepless night. The roads are passable now, Lady Pembroke continued gently. If you intend to let her leave without a word, you have very little time remaining to change your mind. Sebastian rose immediately, his exhaustion forgotten entirely in the sudden urgency of the moment. He thanked his aunt hastily before hurrying from the library, his mind racing with everything he needed to say, everything he had failed to say the night before when fear and duty had held his tongue captive. He found Mrs. Bennet in the entrance hall, already helping to load Alina's belongings into a carriage that had arrived earlier that morning, the roads finally dry enough to permit safe travel. His heart clenched at the sight, at how close he had come to losing this chance entirely through his own hesitation. "Where is she?" he asked urgently. "She is saying goodbye to Lily in the garden, Your Grace," Mrs. Bennet replied, a knowing smile crossing her weathered features, as though she had been hoping for precisely this outcome all along. Sebastian hurried toward the garden, his heart pounding with a mixture of urgency and hope, determined not to let this moment slip away from him as it so nearly had the night before. As he approached, he could hear Lily's voice, small and tearful, carrying across the morning air. "I do not want you to go," Lily was saying, her arms wrapped tightly around Alina's waist, her face buried against the governess's dress. "I know, sweetheart," Alina replied, her own voice thick with unshed tears as she stroked the girl's dark curls gently. "But sometimes we must do difficult things, even when our hearts want something different." Sebastian stood at the edge of the garden path for a moment, watching this tender scene unfold, watching the woman who had so thoroughly captured his heart struggle to maintain her composure while comforting his niece through the pain of yet another loss. And in that moment, watching Alina's quiet strength even as her own heart clearly broke beneath the surface, Sebastian knew with absolute certainty that he could not let her walk away. Not today, not ever, regardless of what obstacles society might place before them. "Alina," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet morning garden. She turned toward him, surprise evident on her tear-streaked face, Lily still clinging tightly to her side. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious emotion still lingering in her eyes. "I was just saying goodbye to Lily. I did not wish to leave without properly bidding her farewell. Sebastian crossed the garden quickly, closing the distance between them with an urgency that left little room for the careful formality they had maintained the night before. "Do not go," he said, the words rushing out before he could second-guess himself any further. Alina's eyes widened with surprise, uncertainty flickering across her features. "Your Grace, we discussed this last night," she began, but Sebastian shook his head firmly, cutting off her protest before it could fully form. "I was wrong last night," he said, his voice earnest and unguarded in a way Alina had rarely witnessed from him before. "I allowed fear and years of ingrained duty to convince me that letting you go was the responsible choice. But I have spent the entire night realizing that responsibility without happiness is simply another form of the same fear that has governed my life for far too long." Alina's breath caught in her throat, hope and disbelief warring across her features as she listened to his words. "What are you saying?" she asked softly. Sebastian took her hand gently, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt regarding his sincerity. "I am saying that I love you," he said simply. "I love you, and I do not wish to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been had I allowed fear of society's judgment to cost me the chance at genuine happiness. Lily loves you. This household has come alive with warmth since your arrival that it has not known in years, and I am done pretending that duty and happiness must always exist in opposition to one another." Lily, still clinging to Alina's side, looked up at her uncle with wide, hopeful eyes. "Does this mean she can stay?" Lily asked eagerly. Sebastian smiled down at his niece, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire expression. "That depends entirely on Alina," he said gently, before turning his attention back to the woman standing before him, awaiting her answer with a vulnerability he had rarely allowed himself to display before this moment. Alina stood frozen for a long moment, tears now falling freely down her cheeks, though these tears carried none of the grief that had marked her earlier goodbye to Lily. She looked between Sebastian's earnest expression and Lily's hopeful face, feeling the weight of the past week settle over her in an entirely new light, no longer a burden of impossible circumstance, but rather a foundation for something genuinely beautiful, if only she was brave enough to reach for it. "Are you certain?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with cautious hope. "Your aunt, society, the reputation you have worked so hard to protect, all of it will be affected by this choice." "I am more certain of this than I have been of anything in years," Sebastian said firmly. "I would rather face whatever judgment society chooses to offer than spend another single day pretending that duty alone is enough to sustain a meaningful life." Alina felt the last of her hesitation crumble away entirely, replaced by a surge of joy so profound it nearly overwhelmed her. She looked down at Lily, at the girl's hopeful, tear-streaked face, then back up at Sebastian, at the man who had ordered her from his house less than a week ago and now stood before her, humble and vulnerable, offering her everything she had never allowed herself to hope for. "Then yes," she said softly, a smile breaking across her own face despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "I will stay." Lily let out a delighted cry at Alina's answer, releasing her hold on Alina's waist only to throw her arms around her uncle instead, laughing with the pure, uncomplicated joy that only a child could express so freely. Sebastian lifted his niece easily, spinning her once before setting her back down, his own laughter mixing with hers in a way that Alina had never witnessed before, the sound so foreign to the cold and guarded man she had first met only a week earlier that she could hardly believe the transformation she was witnessing. Mrs. Bennet, who had followed at a discreet distance to oversee the loading of Alina's belongings, stood at the edge of the garden path with an expression of pure satisfaction, clearly having anticipated this outcome all along. "Shall I have the carriage unpacked, Your Grace?" she called out, unable to fully hide the smile tugging at her lips. Sebastian glanced toward Alina, seeking silent confirmation, and when she nodded, still smiling through her lingering tears, he called back his affirmation, instructing that Alina's belongings be returned to her room, though he added, almost as an afterthought, that perhaps a room closer to the family wing might be more appropriate going forward, a suggestion that made Alina's cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and hope regarding what such a change might signify for their future together. The following days passed in a whirlwind of emotion and careful negotiation, as Sebastian and Alina worked to determine how best to proceed with a relationship that, however genuine and deeply felt, still faced considerable practical obstacles. Lady Pembroke, true to her unexpected change of heart, proved instrumental in helping navigate the delicate matter of introducing Alina to society in a manner that minimized scandal while still allowing the couple to pursue their genuine feelings for one another. It was decided that Sebastian would first formally acknowledge Alina's role within the household, elevating her position from governess to companion for Lily, a transitional title that allowed for a more socially acceptable period of courtship before any formal announcement of deeper intentions might be made. Alina understood the necessity of this careful maneuvering, even as she chafed slightly at the continued need to conceal the true depth of what had grown between them. But she trusted Sebastian's judgment regarding matters of society that remained largely foreign to her own experience. Word of the storm and the subsequent delay in Alina's departure had, of course, already begun to circulate among the local gentry, carried by servants and tenant farmers eager to share whatever gossip they could gather regarding the household of the reclusive Duke of Ashworth. Sebastian addressed these rumors directly rather than allowing speculation to fester unchecked, hosting a small gathering at the estate 2 weeks after the storm had passed, an event carefully designed to introduce Alina to key members of local society under circumstances that emphasized her respectability and the genuine warmth of her character, rather than any scandalous implication. The gathering proved successful beyond what either Sebastian or Alina had dared hope. Alina's natural grace and intelligence, combined with the obvious affection Lily displayed toward her throughout the evening, won over even the most skeptical of Sebastian's acquaintances. Lady Pembroke, ever strategic, ensured that the more influential guests understood the depth of transformation Alina had brought to both Sebastian and Lily's lives, subtly shaping the narrative in a manner that framed the connection as a natural and welcome development, rather than an inappropriate transgression of social boundaries. Not everyone proved so easily won over, however. Miss Catherine Ellsworth, the young woman Lady Pembroke had initially championed as a suitable match for Sebastian, attended the gathering with her mother, and her cool reception of Alina throughout the evening made clear her displeasure at seeing her own prospects with the Duke effectively eliminated by the presence of a mere governess-turned-companion. "You must forgive my confusion," Miss Ellsworth said pointedly at one point during the evening, her tone polite on the surface but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath. "I had understood Miss Whitmore's position here to be that of governess. I was not aware such positions typically led to such elevated status within a household of this standing." Alina met the challenge with the same quiet composure that had served her well throughout years of navigating difficult social positions, refusing to be baited into a defensive or apologetic response. "Circumstances change," Alina replied evenly. "I have found great joy in caring for Lily, and His Grace has been gracious enough to recognize the value of the bond we have formed. I consider myself fortunate indeed to remain part of this household in whatever capacity proves most beneficial to Lily's well-being." Miss Ellsworth's expression tightened slightly at this diplomatic but firm response, clearly recognizing that Alina would not be easily unsettled by pointed remarks or thinly veiled condescension. She excused herself shortly after, her mother following with a stiff nod toward Sebastian that suggested any hope of a future match between the families had been thoroughly extinguished by the evening's revelations. Sebastian, who had observed the exchange from a short distance, crossed to Alina's side once Miss Ellsworth departed, his expression a mixture of admiration and quiet amusement. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly, close enough that only she could hear his words. "I have had considerable practice maintaining composure under difficult circumstances," Alina replied, though a small smile tugged at her own lips as she recalled the sharp edge of Miss Ellsworth's questioning. As the weeks progressed following that initial gathering, Sebastian and Alina's connection continued to deepen, no longer hidden but still carefully navigated with the discretion demanded by their respective positions in society. Sebastian proved himself, in the months that followed, to be exactly the man Alina had glimpsed during that first stormy night in the library. A man capable of tremendous warmth and genuine tenderness, once the walls of fear and duty that had governed his life for so long finally began to crumble away entirely. He applied the lessons Alina had shared regarding Lily's upbringing with genuine dedication, learning to distinguish between reasonable guidance and the rigid, fear-driven control that had characterized his earlier approach to raising his niece. Lily flourished under this gentler, more balanced approach, her natural curiosity and joy no longer suppressed by fear of harsh punishment, but instead nurtured within a framework of loving guidance that allowed her to learn from mistakes without being crushed by them. 3 months after the storm that had first thrown their lives together in such unexpected fashion, Sebastian formally requested Alina's hand in marriage, choosing to do so in the very same garden where he had once ordered her to leave his estate. A deliberate choice meant to transform that painful memory into something entirely different, entirely hopeful. He knelt before her among the roses that had survived the storm, roses that had bloomed even more beautifully in the months since, and spoke words that echoed the honesty and vulnerability he had first shown her during that late-night conversation in the library so many weeks before. "Alina Whitmore," he said, his gray eyes bright with an emotion that had once seemed entirely foreign to his guarded nature, "I once commanded you to leave this estate, believing that duty demanded I protect myself and everyone around me from the possibility of genuine connection. I was wrong. You have taught me that true strength lies not in guarding against love, but in embracing it fully, regardless of the risks it carries. I am asking you now, not as a duke commanding an employee, but as a man humbly requesting the hand of the woman he loves more than he ever believed possible. Will you marry me and remain in this house not as governess or companion, but as my wife, and as Lily's mother in every way that truly matters?" Alina, tears streaming freely down her face, could barely form the words she needed to answer him, so instead she simply nodded, pulling him up from his kneeling position to embrace him fully, their lips finally meeting in the kiss that had been interrupted so many weeks before, a kiss that carried within it every ounce of longing and hope that had built between them since that first stormy night when everything between them began to change. Yes, she finally managed to whisper against his lips, yes, 1,000 times yes. Their engagement was met with far greater acceptance than either of them had dared to hope, Lady Pembroke's earlier advocacy having laid sufficient groundwork within local society to ensure the match was received, if not with universal enthusiasm, then at least with the grudging respect that came from witnessing the genuine transformation both Sebastian and Lily had undergone since Alina's arrival at the estate. Whatever lingering scandal remained faded quickly in the face of the obvious happiness radiating from the entire household, a happiness that proved far more persuasive than any careful social maneuvering could have achieved alone. Their wedding took place in early autumn, a modest but beautiful ceremony held in the estate's chapel, attended by close family and the household staff who had witnessed the entire journey of their unlikely romance unfold over the preceding months. Lily served as flower girl, beaming with pride throughout the entire ceremony, occasionally whispering to nearby guests that she had known all along that Alina and her uncle belonged together, a claim that drew fond laughter from everyone within earshot. As Sebastian and Alina exchanged their vows before the small gathered assembly, both of them reflected privately on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that began with a harsh command to leave and ended, against every expectation either of them had carried into that stormy night, with a lifetime commitment built on genuine love, mutual respect, and the courage to choose happiness even when duty and expectation seemed to demand otherwise. That evening, as the wedding celebrations wound down and the estate finally grew quiet once more, Sebastian found Alina standing at the same window where she had once watched the storm begin its relentless assault against the estate grounds. Though now the view outside showed only a peaceful autumn evening, stars beginning to emerge across a clear and gentle sky. "Do you remember," he said softly, coming to stand beside her, "what I said to you that first night?" "I remember every word," Alina replied, leaning into his embrace as his arms wrapped gently around her. "I am glad," he said, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, "that the storm gave us both the chance to discover how wrong I truly was." Alina smiled, turning in his arms to face him fully, her heart full of a contentment she had never dared to imagine possible during those difficult years of hardship and uncertainty that had defined so much of her life before this moment. "I am glad as well," she said softly, "that by dawn you were begging me to stay forevermore." Sebastian laughed at her gentle teasing, pulling her close for another kiss, and as they stood together in the quiet peace of their wedding night, both of them understood with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, bound not by duty or expectation, but by a love that had proven strong enough to weather even the fiercest of storms. A year passed, and the estate that had once felt cold and heavy with old grief now rang regularly with laughter, warmth settling into every corner of the great house in a way that even the oldest members of the staff claimed they had never witnessed during all their years of service. Alina had settled fully into her role as Duchess, though she never lost the practical grace and quiet strength that had first drawn Sebastian to her during that fateful storm. And Lily continued to flourish under the loving guidance of two parents who balanced structure with genuine warmth in a manner that allowed the girl to grow confident and secure in her place within the family. It was during the early days of autumn, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding, that an unexpected letter arrived at the estate, one that threatened to disturb the peace the family had worked so hard to build. The letter came from a solicitor representing a man named Edmund Caro, Lily's biological father, who had resurfaced after years of complete silence, claiming that circumstances had changed sufficiently for him to now provide properly for his daughter, and requesting that Lily be returned to his custody. Sebastian read the letter with a growing sense of alarm, memories of his sister's suffering at this man's careless hands flooding back with painful clarity. He brought the letter immediately to Alina, his hands trembling slightly as he passed it to her, the old fears he had worked so hard to overcome threatening to resurface at the mere possibility of losing Lily to a man who had already proven himself entirely unworthy of the responsibility of raising a child. "We will not let this happen," Alina said firmly, once she had finished reading the troubling correspondence, her own protective instincts flaring immediately at the thought of Lily being taken from the only stable, loving home she had ever truly known. Sebastian sought legal counsel immediately, determined to protect his niece from a man who had abandoned her without a second thought years before, only to reappear now with claims of reformed character that neither Sebastian nor Alina found remotely credible. The solicitors advised that, while Edmund Caro's parental rights had never been formally severed, the years of complete abandonment, combined with the stable and loving environment Lily now enjoyed under Sebastian's guardianship, would provide strong grounds for contesting any attempt to remove her from the household. The following weeks proved tense as the legal matter unfolded, Sebastian and Alina working together with a united determination that only strengthened the bond they had built since their marriage. They shielded Lily as much as possible from the anxiety surrounding the situation, though the girl, now 10 years old and increasingly perceptive, sensed that something troubling was occurring beneath the surface of their otherwise happy household. One evening, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Lily approached Alina directly, her expression solemn beyond her years. "Is my father trying to take me away?" she asked quietly, having overheard fragments of conversation between the household staff that she was clearly not meant to hear. Alina knelt down to the girl's level, choosing her words with the same careful honesty she had always tried to maintain with Lily, even when the truth was difficult. Someone claiming to be your father has written to your uncle, she said gently. But I want you to understand something very important, Lily. A father is not simply the man who provided the blood in your veins. A father, a true father, is someone who chooses every single day to love and care for you, to put your needs before his own, to be present through both the easy days and the difficult ones. Your uncle has been that person for you since the day he brought you home, and nothing that happens with this legal matter will ever change the love he holds for you, or the love I hold for you as well. Lily's eyes filled with tears, though these tears carried more relief than fear. I do not want to leave, she said softly. This is my home. You and Uncle Sebastian are my real family. You will always have a home here, Elena promised, pulling the girl into a tight embrace. Your uncle and I will do everything within our power to ensure that remains true. The matter finally came to resolution nearly 2 months after the initial letter arrived, when it became clear through further investigation that Edmund Caro's sudden interest in reclaiming his daughter stemmed not from genuine paternal affection, but from financial desperation, an attempt to leverage his parental claim into a substantial settlement from Sebastian in exchange for formally relinquishing his rights. Sebastian, disgusted by this confirmation of the man's continued lack of character, nonetheless agreed to a modest settlement in exchange for Edmund's permanent and legally binding renunciation of any future claim to Lily, prioritizing the certainty of his niece's continued security over any principled refusal to reward such transparently mercenary behavior. The day the final papers were signed, formally and permanently securing Lily's place within their family beyond any possibility of future challenge, Sebastian and Elena celebrated quietly that evening, relief washing over both of them in waves as the lingering anxiety of the preceding months finally released its grip on their household. I never want to feel that fear again, Sebastian admitted that night, holding Elena close as they sat together by the fire in the library, the same room where their own story had first begun to unfold during that stormy night over a year before. The thought of losing her, of watching her taken from the only stable home she has ever known, terrified me more deeply than I can properly express. We faced it together, Elena reminded him gently, and we prevailed. That is what family means, Sebastian, facing whatever challenges arise together without either of us having to carry the burden alone. Sebastian pressed a tender kiss to her forehead, gratitude and love evident in every line of his expression. I do not know what I would have done, he said quietly, if that storm had never trapped you here that first night. If I had never been given the chance to discover the woman you truly are, beneath the composed governess I first dismissed so unfairly. Elena smiled softly, reaching up to gently trace the line of his jaw. Perhaps it was simply meant to be, she said. Some storms destroy everything in their path. Others, it seems, simply clear away the debris blocking us from the life we were always meant to find. As the fire crackled warmly before them, and the peaceful sounds of their sleeping household settled around them, Sebastian and Elena sat together in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might still bring, they would face them as they had faced everything since that first fateful storm, united, resilient, and bound together by a love that had proven, time and again, strong enough to weather any tempest that dared to test it. Their family, built from unlikely beginnings and forged through genuine hardship and honest connection, stood now as a testament to the truth Elena had spoken to Sebastian so long ago in that same quiet library, that love built on honesty and mutual respect could overcome even the deepest fears and the most rigid expectations society sought to impose, and that sometimes the very command meant to drive someone away becomes instead the first step toward a love destined to last forevermore.